The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the weathered depot, and Penelope Jackson pressed her gloved hand against the door frame to steady herself, her heart hammering so hard she could barely draw breath. Through the dust-streaked window, she saw Nogales, Arizona sprawling before her in the afternoon heat of July 1882. A collection of adobe buildings and wooden storefronts that looked nothing like the Boston neighborhood she had fled 3 months ago. The burns on her arms throbbed beneath the long sleeves of her traveling dress, a constant reminder of the fire that had destroyed everything she once knew, and she wondered if the man waiting somewhere in this frontier town would recoil when he finally saw the scars that marked her skin like a map of suffering. The driver opened the door, and Penelope accepted his weathered hand as she descended onto the packed earth street. Her legs trembled from the long journey, but she forced herself to stand straight, clutching the single carpet bag that contained all her earthly possessions. Around her, the town bustled with afternoon activity. Mexican and American voices mingled in the air, horses stamped at hitching posts, and somewhere a blacksmith's hammer rang against an anvil. The heat was oppressive, nothing like the humid summers of Massachusetts, but dry and relentless, pressing down on her like a physical weight. "Miss Jackson," the voice came from behind her, deep and hesitant. Penelope turned and found herself looking up at a man who stood several inches over 6 feet, his broad shoulders filling out a worn work shirt. Xavier Thompson had sandy brown hair that needed cutting, sun-weathered skin, and eyes the color of summer sage that held a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously, and she noticed his fingers were long and capable, the hands of someone who worked hard for his living. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Yes, I am Penelope Jackson." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two strangers bound by letters exchanged over 6 months, words on paper that had painted pictures of loneliness and longing on both sides. Xavier had written of his ranch 15 miles outside town, of cattle and horses and endless sky. He had confessed to being 32 years old, a man who had built something with his own hands but found himself eating meals in silence, sleeping in an empty house, wondering if this was all life had to offer. Penelope had responded with her own carefully worded truths that she was 24, alone in the world, seeking a fresh start somewhere far from the memories that haunted her. She had not mentioned the fire. She had not mentioned the burns. "The journey was long," Xavier said finally, his voice gentle. "You must be exhausted. I have a room for you at the hotel here in town. Thought you might want a night to rest before we head out to the ranch." The consideration in his words surprised her. "That is very kind of you." "I also thought you might want some time," he continued, meeting her eyes directly. "To be sure about this, about marrying a stranger. I know my letters painted a picture, but words are easier than reality. If you want to take the next stage back east, I will understand. I will give you money for the ticket, and enough to get you settled somewhere." Penelope felt something shift in her chest. In his awkwardness, in his honesty, Xavier Thompson was offering her an escape before the trap could close. It would have been so easy to accept, to run again, to find some other town where no one knew about the fire or the accusations that had followed. But she was tired of running, tired of being afraid, and there was something in his sage-colored eyes that made her want to trust again. "I did not travel all this way to turn back now," she said quietly. "Unless you have changed your mind upon seeing me." "No," he said quickly, too quickly, and color rose in his tanned face. "No, you are exactly as I imagined, more so. I just wanted you to know you have a choice." "Then I choose to stay." Xavier's smile transformed his face, erasing years of loneliness from his features. Let me get your trunk. I will take you to the hotel and give you time to freshen up. There is a decent restaurant on the main street. Would you do me the honor of having dinner with me this evening, so we can talk properly, get to know each other beyond letters? I would like that very much. He retrieved her trunk from the stagecoach and carried it easily, leading her down the street to a two-story hotel with a broad veranda. The interior was surprisingly cool, the thick adobe walls keeping out the worst of the heat. Xavier secured a room for her and carried her belongings upstairs, setting them down just inside the door. "I will come back at 6, he said from the doorway. "That will give you a few hours to rest." After he left, Penelope sat on the bed and looked around the simple room. A washstand stood in the corner with a pitcher of water and a basin. A small mirror hung on the wall. The bed was narrow but clean, covered with a colorful Mexican blanket. For the first time in months, she felt something that might have been the beginning of peace. She rose and poured water into the basin, then slowly began to unbutton her dress. The fabric stuck to her skin with perspiration, and she peeled it away carefully. Beneath the long sleeves, her arms bore the evidence of the fire that had consumed her aunt's boarding house. The burns ran from her wrists to her elbows on both arms, puckered scar tissue in shades of pink and white. The doctors had said she was lucky, that her quick thinking had saved her from worse injury. But luck felt like a cruel word when she looked at the permanent marks the flames had left behind. She had been sleeping when the fire started, awakened by smoke and the sound of her aunt screaming. Penelope had run through the hallway, pounding on doors to wake the boarders, her arms exposed in her nightgown as she beat against the burning wood. She had gotten everyone out, but her aunt had run back inside for a strong box of money and never emerged. The building had collapsed in a shower of sparks and ash, taking her aunt's life and Penelope's innocence with it. The marshal had ruled it an accident, a knocked-over lamp, but whispers had followed Penelope through Boston streets. Her aunt's nephew, a spiteful man who had expected to inherit, had started rumors that Penelope had set the fire deliberately, that she had wanted the boarding house for herself. Never mind that her aunt had left everything to a distant cousin in New York, or that Penelope had nearly died trying to save lives. The whispers had been enough to make her an outcast, to make finding work impossible, to drive her to answer Xavier Thompson's advertisement for a mail-order bride. Penelope washed the travel dust from her face and arms, wincing as the water touched the sensitive scar tissue. She would have to tell Xavier about the burns. He would see them eventually if they married. The thought of his reaction made her stomach twist with anxiety. Would he look at her with disgust, pity? Would he withdraw his offer, decide she was too damaged for the life he envisioned? She dressed in a fresh gown, another long-sleeved garment despite the heat, and lay down on the bed to rest. Exhaustion pulled her under almost immediately, and she slept deeply for the first time in weeks. A knock at the door woke her. The light slanting through the window had changed, grown golden with approaching evening. Penelope sat up, momentarily disoriented, then remembered where she was. "Miss Jackson," Xavier's voice came through the door. "It is 6 o'clock." "Just a moment," she called back, rising quickly to check her appearance in the mirror. She smoothed her hair, pinched her cheeks for color, and went to open the door. Xavier had cleaned up as well, wearing a fresh shirt and string tie, his hair damp from washing. He offered his arm, and they walked together down the stairs and out into the evening air. The temperature had dropped slightly, making the walk pleasant as they headed toward the restaurant. The establishment was crowded with townspeople and ranch hands, the air thick with the smell of cooking meat and fresh tortillas. Xavier guided her to a corner table, somewhere relatively quiet, and held her chair as she sat. The courtesy felt foreign after months of being treated like a pariah in Boston. "The beef here is excellent," Xavier said, studying the simple menu. "They serve it with beans and rice and fresh tortillas. There is also chicken if you prefer. The beef sounds wonderful." He ordered for them both in passable Spanish, and Penelope watched him interact with the Mexican woman who took their order, noting the easy respect in his manner. When the woman left, Xavier folded his hands on the table and looked at Penelope with those searching sage eyes. "Tell me something true," he said quietly, "something you did not put in your letters." The request surprised her with its directness. "What do you mean?" "I mean we have been writing pretty words to each other for months, but now you are real, sitting across from me, and I want to know the real woman, not just the words on paper. So tell me something true, something hard maybe, something that matters." Penelope's mouth went dry. This was the moment then. She could deflect, could offer some small truth and keep the larger ones hidden, but something in his gaze made her want to be honest. If this marriage was to have any chance, it needed to start with truth. "I was in a fire," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 months ago. My aunt's boarding house burned down. I got everyone out, but my aunt died, and I have burns on my arms from beating on the doors." She stopped, watching his face for signs of revulsion or rejection. Xavier did not flinch. That must have been terrifying. It was. But that was not the worst part. The words were tumbling out now, months of silence breaking like a dam. "After my aunt's nephew started rumors that I had set the fire, that I wanted to inherit the property. It was not true. I loved my aunt, and she left everything to a cousin anyway, but people believed him. They looked at me like I was a murderer. I could not find work. I could not walk down the street without whispers following me. So I answered your advertisement because I needed to go somewhere no one knew my story." The silence that followed felt eternal. Xavier sat very still, his eyes never leaving her face. Finally, he leaned forward slightly. "Did you set the fire?" "No," the word came out fierce. "I swear on everything holy I did not. I woke up choking on smoke and ran to save people. That is all." "Then that is all that matters to me," Xavier said simply. "You saved lives. You bear the scars from your courage. That is not something to be ashamed of." Tears pricked Penelope's eyes, threatening to spill over. "You do not understand. The burns are ugly. They cover both arms from wrist to elbow. When you see them, you might feel differently." Xavier was quiet for a moment, then reached across the table and gently took one of her gloved hands in his. Even through the fabric, she could feel the warmth and strength in his grip. "I have scars too," he said quietly. "Not on the outside where everyone can see, but inside where they cut just as deep. My wife died 5 years ago in childbirth. The baby too. A son. I held him for 10 minutes before he stopped breathing." His voice roughened. "I blamed myself for a long time. Thought if I had gotten the doctor faster, or if I had not gotten her pregnant in the first place, or if I had been a better husband, somehow it would have been different. Those are my burns, Penelope. We all carry fire damage of one kind or another." Penelope turned her hand in his grip so their palms pressed together, even through her glove. "I am so sorry. I am sorry, too, for what you went through, but I am not sorry you are here." He paused. "Would you show me the burns? I know you are worried about my reaction, and I would rather you know now that they do not change anything." Her heart hammered against her ribs. They were in a public place, surrounded by other diners, but the corner table offered some privacy. Slowly, Penelope released his hand and began to unbutton the cuff of her right sleeve. She pushed the fabric up to her elbow, exposing the mottled scar tissue beneath. Xavier looked at her arm for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached out and gently traced one finger along the worst of the scarring, his touch feather light and unutterably careful. "Does it still hurt?" "Sometimes. It aches in cold weather and the skin is more sensitive than it used to be. But mostly it just reminds me of what happened." "These are marks of courage," he said firmly. "You ran into danger to save others. That takes a rare kind of strength." He met her eyes. "I am honored that you would trust me with this truth." The food arrived then, steaming plates of beef and beans and fresh tortillas, and Penelope rolled her sleeve back down with shaking fingers. As they ate, the conversation turned to lighter topics. Xavier told her about his ranch, the herd he was building, the house he had expanded himself over the past year. Penelope shared memories of Boston that did not involve the fire, stories of her childhood, of learning to sew and cook from her aunt, of books she had read and dreams she had harbored. By the time they finished dinner, the sky outside had darkened to deep indigo, stars beginning to emerge in the vast expanse above. Xavier walked her back to the hotel, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, a touch that felt protective rather than possessive. "What happens now?" Penelope asked as they stood outside her door. "Now you get a good night's sleep," Xavier said. "Tomorrow, if you are still willing, we will see the preacher and make this official. Then I will take you home to the ranch, but only if you are certain this is what you want." "I meant what I said earlier. You have a choice." "I am certain," Penelope said, and realized it was true. In the span of a few hours, Xavier Thompson had shown her more kindness and understanding than she had experienced in months. Whatever happened next, she wanted to face it with him. He smiled, that transforming expression that made him look younger and less careworn. "Then I will see you in the morning. Sleep well, Penelope." "Good night, Xavier." She watched him walk away, his long stride carrying him down the hall and out of sight, then entered her room and closed the door. For a long time, she stood at the window, looking out at the unfamiliar town under its blanket of stars, feeling something that might have been hope beginning to bloom in her chest. Morning came bright and hot. Penelope dressed in her best gown, a pale blue cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, and pinned her dark hair up carefully. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, nerves and anticipation making her clumsy. By the time Xavier knocked at her door, she had changed her mind about her hair 3 times and settled on a simple arrangement that would not look too elaborate for a frontier wedding. Xavier wore a dark suit that looked uncomfortable in the heat, but made him appear more formal, more serious. He held out a small bouquet of wildflowers, desert blooms in shades of yellow and purple. "I picked these this morning," he said, almost shyly. "Thought you might want to hold something." Penelope took the flowers, touched by the gesture. "They are beautiful." The church was a small adobe building with a wooden cross above the door. Inside, it was cool and dim, lit by candles and the sunlight filtering through narrow windows. The preacher was an older man with kind eyes and a Spanish accent, and he conducted the ceremony in both English and Spanish, a reflection of the border town's mixed heritage. The service was brief, but meaningful. Xavier's voice was steady as he spoke his vows, promising to honor and protect her, to provide for her, to be faithful until death. When Penelope spoke her own promises, she felt the weight of them, the commitment she was making to this man she barely knew, but already trusted more than people she had known her entire life. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher said, and Xavier leaned down carefully, pressing his lips to hers in a chaste but sincere kiss that made her heart flutter. They signed the marriage certificate in the church records, Xavier's handwriting bold and clear, Penelope's more delicate. The preacher's wife and the church sexton served as witnesses, smiling at them both with the warmth reserved for newlyweds. Outside, The morning sun was climbing higher, the heat already intense. Xavier had brought a wagon into town, loaded with supplies he had purchased earlier. He helped Penelope up onto the seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Ready to see your new home?" he asked. "Ready," she confirmed. The journey to the ranch took nearly 2 hours, following a rutted road that wound through desert landscape dotted with scrub, brush, and cacti. In the distance, mountains rose purple against the bright sky. Xavier pointed out landmarks as they went, a creek that ran year-round, the boundary line of his property, the place where he had once seen a mountain lion. "It is isolated," he said as they rattled along. "The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. Town is a half-day trip by wagon. I want you to know what you are getting into. It can be lonely out here, especially for someone used to city life." "I think I could use some loneliness," Penelope said honestly. "After Boston, after being stared at and whispered about everywhere I went, the idea of isolation sounds like a blessing." Xavier nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that, but if you ever want to go into town for supplies or just to be around people, you tell me. I do not want you to feel trapped." The ranch appeared gradually, first as a cluster of buildings in the distance, then resolving into a house, a barn, several corrals, and various outbuildings. The house itself was larger than Penelope had expected, a single-story structure with a deep porch running along the front. Xavier had built it from local materials, adobe walls and a wooden roof, designed to stay cool in summer and hold heat in winter. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, then came around to help Penelope descend. For a moment they stood together looking at the building that would be their home. "It is not fancy," Xavier said, "but it is solid. I built most of it myself over the past 8 years, added on to the original structure, which was just 3 rooms. It is wonderful," Penelope said sincerely. The house had a settled, permanent quality that appealed to her after so much upheaval. Xavier carried her trunk inside, and Penelope followed him into the cool interior. The main room was large, with a stone fireplace at one end and a kitchen area at the other. Furniture was sparse but well made, clearly built by hand. Doorways led off to other rooms, and Xavier gave her a tour, showing her the bedroom that had been his but would now be theirs, a smaller guest room, a room he used for storage and as an office of sorts. "I moved my things into the guest room last week," he said, standing in the doorway of the main bedroom. "Thought you might want time before we share a bed. There is no rush, Penelope. We are married legally, but I do not expect you to be a wife to me in all ways until you are ready." The consideration again, the care for her feelings. Penelope felt tears threatening once more, overwhelmed by this man's unexpected gentleness. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I appreciate that more than you know." They spent the rest of the morning settling Penelope's few belongings into the house. Xavier showed her where everything was kept, the pantry stocked with dry goods, the root cellar cool and dark, the well behind the house with its sweet water. He introduced her to the animals, 3 horses and 2 dozen cattle grazing in the nearby pastures, a few chickens scratching in a coop beside the barn. "I have a hand who comes 3 days a week," Xavier explained as they walked back toward the house. "Miguel Santos. He lives in town with his family, but he helps with the heavy work, mending fences and breaking horses. Good man. You will like him." For lunch, Penelope insisted on cooking, wanting to prove her usefulness. She found bacon and eggs, canned tomatoes and dried beans, and made a simple but filling meal. Xavier ate with evident appreciation, complimenting her cooking in a way that seemed genuine rather than merely polite. After lunch, Xavier said he needed to ride out to check on the cattle in the far pasture and invited her to come along. Penelope accepted eagerly, glad for an excuse to see more of the property. Xavier saddled 2 horses, a gray gelding for himself and a smaller bay mare for her. "Daisy is gentle," he said as he helped Penelope into the saddle. "She has been mine for years, but I think she will be yours now. She deserves someone who will give her more attention than I have lately." They rode out across land that seemed to stretch forever. Under a sky so vast, it made Penelope feel both insignificant and strangely free. Xavier was a skilled rider, moving with his horse as though they were one creature, and he patiently adjusted their pace to match Penelope's more tentative horsemanship. The cattle were scattered across a broad meadow near the creek Xavier had mentioned earlier. He counted them carefully, making notes in a small book he carried, checking for any signs of illness or injury. While he worked, Penelope dismounted and walked to the creek's edge, watching the water flow over smooth stones, marveling at how different this landscape was from everything she had known. "You look thoughtful," Xavier said, coming to stand beside her. "I am thinking how strange life is," Penelope replied. 3 months ago I was in Boston, living above my aunt's boarding house, planning to take over management when she retired. Now I am in Arizona, married to a man I just met, surrounded by more space than I have ever seen in my life. It feels like a dream. A good dream or a bad one? Good, she said, turning to look at him. Definitely good. Xavier smiled, and they stood together in companionable silence, listening to the creek and the distant lowing of cattle. The afternoon heat was intense, but the shade of the cottonwood trees provided relief, and a slight breeze stirred the air. On the ride back to the house, Xavier pointed out more features of the land, places where he planned to expand, ideas he had for improvement. Penelope listened, hearing in his words the dreams of a man who had worked hard and alone for too long, who finally had someone to share his plans with. That night, Penelope made dinner while Xavier tended to evening chores. She found the kitchen well equipped, with cast iron pans and good knives, a proper stove that heated evenly. She made stew from the beef Xavier had brought in from the cold cellar, with potatoes and carrots and onions, and biscuits that rose golden in the oven. They ate at the simple wooden table, talking about the day, making plans for the week ahead. Xavier told her about Miguel, who would arrive the next morning, and warned her that the man's English was rough but his work ethic was strong. Penelope shared her ideas for a garden, vegetables and herbs that might thrive in the desert heat with proper watering. After dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sun set in spectacular fashion, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple and red. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun disappeared, the desert night bringing blessed coolness. "I should get some sleep," Xavier said eventually. "Morning comes early on a ranch, but if you need anything in the night, anything at all, you come get me. Do not hesitate." "I will," Penelope promised. She lay awake for a long time in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the night sounds of the desert, the distant cry of a coyote, the whisper of wind against the walls. Despite the strangeness, despite the newness of everything, she felt safer than she had in months. The days fell into a rhythm. Xavier rose before dawn and tended to the animals while Penelope made breakfast. They ate together, then Xavier went out to work the ranch while Penelope tackled the house, learning the routines of her new life. Miguel arrived as promised, a wiry man in his 40s with weathered skin and a quick smile. His English was indeed rough, but his warmth was universal, and he greeted Penelope with respectful courtesy that made her feel welcome. Over the following weeks, Penelope transformed the house into a home. She made curtains from fabric Xavier bought in town, planted the garden she had planned, learned to bake bread in the temperamental oven. Xavier proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to care for the horses, how to collect eggs from the irascible hens, how to read the land and the sky for signs of weather changes. The heat of summer intensified, making midday work nearly impossible. They adjusted their schedule, rising earlier to accomplish tasks before the worst of the day, resting during the afternoon hours, resuming work in the cooler evening. Penelope found the rhythm suited her, the forced rest a time for reading or sewing or simply sitting in the shaded house. Xavier continued to sleep in the guest room, never pushing, never demanding more than Penelope was willing to give. But as the days passed, she found herself increasingly drawn to him, appreciating not just his consideration but his quiet strength, his dry humor, the way he looked at her like she was precious. Small touches became more common, his hand on her shoulder as he passed, her fingers brushing his as she handed him a cup of coffee, the casual intimacy of two people learning to orbit each other. One evening, about 6 weeks after her arrival, Penelope was washing dishes after dinner when she felt a sharp pain in her arm. She gasped and nearly dropped the plate she was holding. Xavier, who had been reading at the table, was at her side instantly. "What is wrong?" "Nothing, just my arm," Penelope said, trying to downplay it. "The scars sometimes hurt when I overwork them. I was scrubbing hard." "Let me see," Xavier said gently. Penelope hesitated, then set down the dish and unbuttoned her sleeve, pushing it up to reveal the burned scars. In the lamplight, they looked particularly vivid, the tissue shiny and tight. Xavier studied them with a frown, then carefully took her arm in his hands, his touch gentle. "These need proper care," he said. "Have you been treating them with anything?" "I have some salve the doctor gave me, but I ran out a few weeks ago." "Why did you not tell me? I would have gotten more from town." "I did not want to be a bother." Xavier looked up at her, his sage eyes serious. "Penelope, you are my wife. Taking care of you is not a bother. It is what I want to do, what I am supposed to do." He guided her to a chair at the table, then rummaged in a cabinet until he found a tin. "This is something Miguel's wife makes," he explained. "It is for cuts and scrapes, but it might help with the tightness." He opened the tin to reveal a greenish salve that smelled of herbs. Xavier pulled his chair close to hers and gently took her arm again, placing it carefully across his lap. He dipped his fingers into the salve and began to apply it to her scars with infinite care, his touch so light it barely registered. Penelope watched his face as he worked, saw the concentration there, the desire to help without causing pain. "Tell me if I hurt you," he said quietly, working the salve in small circles. "You are not hurting me," Penelope whispered. "You are being very gentle." He moved up her arm slowly, covering every inch of scarred skin with the soothing salve. His fingers found the places where the tissue was tightest and massaged carefully, easing the tension. Penelope felt tears welling in her eyes, overwhelmed by the tenderness of the gesture. No one had touched her burn since the doctors in Boston, and their ministrations had been clinical, impersonal. This was something entirely different. "Other arm," Xavier said when he finished the first, and Penelope offered her left arm without hesitation. He repeated the process, his hands sure and gentle, taking his time. The salve warmed against her skin, and she felt the chronic ache beginning to ease. When he finished, he rolled her sleeves back down carefully and returned the tin to the cabinet. "We will do this every night," he said, "until they feel better. Xavier, you do not have to." "I know I do not have to, I want to." He sat back down and took both her hands in his. "Penelope, I know we married as strangers. I know you were running from a hard situation and I was lonely and looking for companionship. But these past weeks, living with you, learning who you are, I have come to care for you deeply. You are brave and strong and kind, and I count myself fortunate that you answered my advertisement." Penelope's heart was racing. "I care for you too," she said softly. "More than I expected to. More than I knew was possible in such a short time." Xavier leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, and kissed her. It was different from their wedding kiss, deeper and more meaningful, a kiss between two people who were beginning to understand what they meant to each other. Penelope kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I do not want to rush you," he said. "But I also do not want to keep pretending I am content with sleeping in separate rooms. I want to be your husband in every way, Penelope, when you are ready." "I am ready," she whispered. "I have been ready for weeks. I was just afraid you still saw me as an obligation, as someone you agreed to marry out of loneliness." "Never," Xavier said fiercely. "You are no obligation. You are a gift I did not expect and do not deserve." They stood together, hands clasped, and walked to the bedroom they would finally share. Xavier lit the lamp, turning it low, and they undressed with shy glances and nervous smiles, learning the landscape of each other's bodies. Penelope's scars were visible in the lamplight, but Xavier traced them with his fingertips and his lips, showing her without words that they did not diminish her beauty in his eyes. Their lovemaking was tender and careful, two people learning each other, discovering what brought pleasure and what drew sighs. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Penelope's head on Xavier's chest, his arm wrapped securely around her. "I love you," Xavier said into the darkness. "I know it is soon, but it is true. I love you, Penelope." "I love you too," she replied, and felt the truth of it in every fiber of her being. The summer deepened, August heat baking the land until everything shimmered. The garden Penelope had planted thrived under her careful tending, providing fresh vegetables that supplemented their diet of beef and beans. She learned to preserve food for the coming winter, putting up jars of tomatoes and pickles and jam made from wild berries Xavier found near the creek. Miguel's wife, Rosa, came to visit one day, bringing her youngest daughter. The women spent the afternoon together, Rosa teaching Penelope in broken English and patient gestures how to make tortillas properly, how to season beans the way the locals preferred. It was the beginning of a friendship that would sustain Penelope through the isolation of ranch life, a connection to the wider community of Nogales and its surrounding homesteads. Xavier continued the nightly ritual of treating Penelope's scars, his hands learning the terrain of her arms so well he could work in near darkness. The salve helped, but Penelope suspected it was more the consistent gentle touch that made the real difference. The chronic ache faded, and the tightness in the worst of the scarring eased. More than that, the ritual became a time of connection, a space for quiet conversation about the day's events and dreams for the future. In September, Xavier took Penelope into town for the Harvest Festival, a celebration that brought together the American and Mexican communities in a day of music and food and dancing. Penelope wore her best dress and felt Xavier's pride as he introduced her to the townspeople, his wife, a word he spoke with unmistakable warmth. They danced together in the town square, Xavier surprisingly graceful for such a large man, spinning her under the paper lanterns as a mariachi band played. That night, as they drove home under a sky brilliant with stars, Penelope realized she was completely happy. The past, with all its pain and accusation, felt distant and unimportant. This was her life now, this land and this man, and she would not trade it for anything. October brought cooler weather and the first real test of their marriage. A neighbor's cattle broke through a fence line, and mixed with Xavier's herd, leading to a tense negotiation about ownership and damages. Xavier handled it with patience and firmness, but Penelope saw the stress it caused him, the way he lay awake at night worrying about money and the approach of winter. She began looking for ways to contribute financially, using skills from her life in Boston. She started taking in mending from townspeople, then progressed to making shirts and dresses, her reputation for fine needlework spreading by word of mouth. The extra money was small but meaningful, and Xavier's gratitude was evident in the way he held her closer at night, whispering thank yous against her hair. In November, Penelope missed her monthly courses. She waited a week, then two, before allowing herself to believe what it might mean. When she finally told Xavier, he swept her up in his arms with a shout of joy that sent the chickens scattering. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Penelope asked, needing to hear it. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Xavier said, setting her down gently as though she were made of glass. "After losing my first child, I thought I would never have another chance. This is more than I dared to hope for." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months. Xavier became even more protective, taking over heavy chores and insisting Penelope rest more. She tolerated his hovering with good humor, understanding it came from a place of love and old fear. The winter was mild by Eastern standards, though the desert nights grew cold enough to make them grateful for the fireplace and the thick adobe walls. Christmas came, and they celebrated quietly together, exchanging simple gifts. Xavier gave Penelope a shawl he had commissioned from Rosa, beautifully woven in patterns of red and gold. Penelope gave Xavier a new shirt she had made, with careful stitching and mother-of-pearl buttons bought from her sewing money. They attended Christmas Mass in town, the church overflowing with families, and Penelope felt a sense of belonging she had not experienced since before the fire. January brought cold winds and the occasional frost, but no snow this far south. Penelope's belly swelled with the growing child, and she felt the first fluttering movements that Xavier insisted on feeling too. His large hand spread across her stomach, his face alight with wonder when the baby kicked. In February, as the desert began to warm again toward spring, Penelope woke in the night with contractions. Xavier fetched Rosa, who served as midwife for the area, and then spent the long hours of labor pacing the main room while Rosa and Penelope worked through the process in the bedroom. The labor was hard but not unusually so. Rosa was experienced and calm, guiding Penelope through each contraction, encouraging her when the pain seemed unbearable. Xavier appeared periodically at the door, his face pale with worry, until Rosa finally snapped at him in Spanish to stop hovering and make himself useful by boiling more water. Dawn was breaking when the baby finally emerged, a healthy boy with a strong set of lungs and his father's promise of height in his long limbs. Rosa cleaned him and wrapped him in the blanket Penelope had made, then placed him in his mother's arms. "Perfect," Rosa said with satisfaction. "A perfect son." Xavier came into the room tentatively, as though afraid of what he might find, then broke into tears when he saw Penelope sitting up in bed, tired but smiling, holding their son. He knelt beside the bed and gathered them both carefully into his arms. "Thank you," he whispered against Penelope's hair. "Thank you for this gift, for giving me another chance." They named him James after Xavier's father, with the middle name of William after Penelope's father. James Thomas Thompson made his presence known immediately, crying lustily when hungry and sleeping in short bursts that left his parents exhausted but deliriously happy. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to bring the baby to Penelope for feeding, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours simply holding his son and marveling at the tiny perfection of his fingers and toes. Penelope watched him with the baby and fell in love with him all over again, seeing in his gentleness with their child an echo of the gentleness he had always shown her. Spring came in full force, the desert blooming with unexpected color after the winter rains. Penelope's garden flourished, and she spent hours outside with James in a basket beside her, working the soil and planning expansions. Her scars no longer troubled her much, though Xavier continued the nightly ritual of salve application whenever she mentioned any discomfort. The burns had become simply a part of her, a reminder of survival rather than a source of shame. In April, a letter arrived from Boston, forwarded through multiple addresses before finally finding Penelope in Arizona. It was from the cousin who had inherited her aunt's property, a man Penelope had never met. He wrote to inform her that her aunt's nephew had been arrested for fraud in an unrelated matter, and during the investigation had confessed to starting the fire himself for the insurance money. The confession had cleared Penelope's name completely, and the cousin wanted her to know that anyone who had believed the accusations now knew the truth. Penelope read the letter twice, then handed it to Xavier without comment. He read it carefully, then folded it and set it aside. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. "I do not know," Penelope said honestly. "Relieved, I suppose, vindicated, but also it seems like it happened to someone else. That life in Boston, those accusations, they feel so far away now, like they happened to a different person." "In a way they did," Xavier said. "You are not the same woman who arrived on that stagecoach last summer. You are stronger now. Happier. You are my wife and James's mother, and you have built a life here that has nothing to do with the past." "I suppose you are right," Penelope said, then looked at the letter again. "Should I write back? Should I tell him where I am and what has happened?" Xavier shrugged. "That is your choice. But if you do, make sure he knows you have no intention of coming back. This is your home now. With me and James. That matters more than any vindication from people who should have believed in you from the start." Penelope did write back, a brief letter thanking the cousin for the information and letting him know she was married and settled in Arizona. She did not give details, did not invite further correspondence. That chapter of her life was closed, and she had no desire to reopen it. Summer returned, the heat more bearable now that Penelope knew what to expect and how to manage it. James grew quickly, changing almost daily, becoming more alert and responsive. Miguel and Rosa doted on him, as did the handful of neighbors who visited occasionally. Penelope found herself part of a community, connected to the other women through the shared experiences of motherhood and ranch life. In August, on the first anniversary of Penelope's arrival in Nogales, Xavier declared a celebration. He arranged for Miguel to watch the ranch for the day and took Penelope and James into town. They had lunch at the same restaurant where they had eaten their first meal together, James sleeping peacefully in Penelope's arms while they reminisced about that awkward evening. How much had changed in a year. After lunch, they walked through the town, Xavier's arm around Penelope's waist, stopping to show James the various sights of his world. At the general store, Xavier bought Penelope a length of beautiful fabric for a new dress, insisting despite her protests that she deserved something special. As they prepared to leave town, they passed the depot where Penelope had arrived a year earlier. Xavier pulled the wagon to a stop and looked at her seriously. "I want you to know something," he said. "If you ever want to leave, if you ever decide this life is not enough, I will understand. I will not hold you here against your will." Penelope stared at him in shock. "Why would you say that? Why would you even think I might want to leave?" "Because I see how hard you work," Xavier said. "How isolated it can be." Because you came from a city, from a life with more society and culture, and I've given you a ranch in the middle of nowhere. Because I love you, and I want you to be happy, and if that means letting you go, I will do it." Penelope handed James to Xavier and took his face in both her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Listen to me very carefully, Xavier Thompson. I am not going anywhere. This ranch, this life, it is not settling or making do. It is everything I want. You are everything I want. You and James and this desert and the silence and the space. I have never been happier in my entire life, and if you try to send me away, I will refuse to go." Xavier smiled, relief evident in every line of his face. "I just needed to be sure." "Be sure," Penelope said firmly. "Be absolutely certain that I choose this life every single day. I choose you every single day. Nothing would make me leave." They kissed there in the wagon, James between them, the Arizona sun beating down, and Penelope felt the absolute rightness of the moment. This was her family, her home, her future. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were droughts that stressed the cattle and threatened the garden. There were hard winters and scorching summers. There was illness and injury and the constant work of maintaining the ranch. But through it all, Penelope and Xavier faced everything together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. James was joined by a sister 2 years later, a daughter they named Lucy after Penelope's mother, and then another son 3 years after that, Michael, named for no one in particular but simply because they both liked the name. The house expanded again, Xavier adding rooms to accommodate their growing family, building with the same patient care he brought to everything he did. Penelope's sewing business grew as well, her reputation spreading beyond Nogales to neighboring towns. She took on larger projects, making wedding dresses and fancy garments for special occasions, her work sought after for its quality and artistry. The extra income allowed them to expand the ranch, buying more cattle and another parcel of land. Xavier became a respected figure in the territory, known for his fair dealing and hard work. He served on the town council for several years and helped establish a proper school in Nogales, wanting his children to have opportunities for education. Miguel eventually bought land adjacent to the ranch, building his own small spread with Xavier's help and advice, the two men becoming not just employer and employee but genuine friends. Penelope kept the letter from Boston tucked away in a drawer, taking it out occasionally to remind herself of where she had come from. But the memories of the fire and the accusations faded with time, replaced by stronger, better memories of the life she had built. Her scars remained, permanent marks on her skin, but they no longer caused pain. Instead, they served as a reminder of her strength, of what she had survived, of the journey that had brought her to Xavier. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier and Penelope rowed out to the creek where he had first told her he was falling in love with her. They left the children with Rosa for the afternoon and spent hours by the water, talking and laughing and remembering. The years had marked them both, lines around Xavier's eyes from squinting into the sun, silver threading through Penelope's dark hair, but the love between them had only deepened. "You ever regret it?" Penelope asked as they sat on the creek bank, her head on his shoulder. "Advertising for a mail-order bride, taking such a chance on a stranger." "Never," Xavier said firmly. "You are the best decision I ever made, the best thing that ever happened to me besides our children." "I was so frightened when I stepped off that stagecoach," Penelope confessed. "I was sure you would take one look at me and realize you had made a mistake." "I did realize something when I saw you," Xavier said. "I realized that I was the luckiest man in Arizona, that somehow, impossibly, a woman like you had chosen to come to me. We chose each other. Penelope corrected. We both took a chance, and it paid off beyond anything I could have imagined. Xavier turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her sleeves. Penelope nodded, and he carefully unbuttoned her cuffs and,